Hello, my name is Marko Jovanović and I'm a research assistant at the Institute of Social Sciences in Belgrade, Serbia. In my lecture, I'm going to talk to you about the challenge that Islam is deemed to present to the concept of multiculturalism and multicultural policies in Western Europe. This topic gained significance especially since 2015 and so-called immigration crisis, when large numbers of migrants and refugees from the predominantly Muslim countries of the Middle East, North Africa and West Asia started heading to Europe in hope for a better future. This put the European Union to the test. Fundamental European values, such as those established in the Treaty of Lisbon and common interests and goals of the EU, have shown their limitations as the nationalism, far-right and populism rose. First, let me provide you with a short overview of my lecture. At the beginning, I will examine the historical emergence of Muslim immigrant communities in Western Europe and its transformation from temporary guest workers to permanent residents. After that, I will point out how self-proclaimed universality of liberalism and Islamic sense of superiority and exceptionalism represent two competing worldviews that led to failure of multiculturalism, which is unsuccessful to accommodate to Islamic practices. This is well illustrated by the debate on hijab, a headscarf some Muslim women wear. Next, the lecture will turn to mutual anxiety between the two groups that emerge over time and socio-economic situation, which created an underclass of young European Muslims who, due to ghettoization and inability to find employment in the lack of other alternatives, are prone to embracing radical religious beliefs. It should be stressed, though, that not all Muslims incline to such interpretations of Islam. Quite opposite. Nevertheless, it is often portrayed so by populists who tend to exploit the situation, which I will indicate to later before giving my concluding remarks. So Muslim immigration to Europe and their integration happened to be a long-standing question. It was during the economic reconstruction after the Second World War that large-scale immigration of Muslims to Western Europe started, as they were sought as low-paid guest workers who were there to stay only temporary as long as they are needed to rebuild war-torn economies of receiving countries. European states expected them to return to their homelands eventually when the need for their labor ceases to exist. The global economic recession that came after the Arab-Israeli War in 1973 and the oil boycott did make European countries stop importing a workforce due to new circumstances. In order to solve the questions of unneeded and unqualified immigrant guest workers, some countries such as Germany, the Netherlands, France, even offered them financial help to return to their home countries, but it didn't happen. The predominantly male labor workers mostly chose to stay regardless of unfavorable economy. They preferred to stay jobless and live off social welfare in Western Europe over the risk of going back to their homelands, where they would face unemployment in struggling third world economies. It should be emphasized that these new economic conditions have directly increased the resentment of immigrants, as they were no longer seen as needed cheap labor but as a competition in the unfriendly job market. That's where we should look for the roots of current social cleavages between Muslim immigrants and native Europeans. Eventually, Muslims and other immigrants in Western Europe were allowed to bring their families to join them in Europe. This led to significant shifts, as in the 1970s they grew from mostly male temporary guest workers living away from the public eye to become permanently settled family communities. Muslim men were now accompanied by their wives and children. Although they didn't worry about identity questions and integration before, when they were alone, now they started to do so. Concerns about their children being able to fit in and at the same time preserve their specific identities, as well as a fear of assimilation, were preoccupying their thoughts. That's why Muslim immigrants started re-examining their identities, not only in ethnic and national, but also in religious terms. It was a challenge to do so in nominally Christian, but de facto secular Western European context. Transformation that occurred and new socio-demographic profile of Muslim immigrants also led to them voicing their demands for host states to better accommodate specific religious needs of their children in schools. As parents wanted to act as good role models for their children, they did the same in their workplaces and some other public institutions such as hospitals. Due to that, Muslim immigrants became much more visible in the Western European societies than it was the case only a few years before that, at least in the cultural sense. But the Muslim communities in the West really became vocal only since the 1980s, when the second generation of immigrants grew up enough to initiate a debate. Unlike their parents, these young people were much less reserved about engaging in politics. In addition to that, they were more self-aware, skilled, and familiar with social institutions and political systems of their receiving countries. In order to better pursue their agenda and achieve stronger and more effective results, Muslim immigrants formed united fronts in Western European countries which disregarded ethnic and other differences. What conjoined them was their shared Islamic religion. Frustrated by the hardship they faced in acquiring equal civil rights and finding employment, they started turning to religion in the search for a source of positive self-identification. Hence, how others perceive and represent Islam became increasingly significant for Muslim immigrants in Europe. This co-occurred with the rise of political Islam and increased awareness of the importance of religion in the social lives of Muslims worldwide. In decades that preceded, many Muslim lands saw an end to their colonial and imperial oppression, gained independence and hope for a better future. But what became evident soon was the inability of Muslim countries to achieve true economic and political independence. This was stressed by the failure of Arab socialist nationalism and other secular political ideologies. The limited political power of the Muslim world was further emphasized by devastating defeats in Arab-Israeli wars of 1967 and 1973. Consequently, since the 1970s, political Islam and fundamentalism started to gain much more monument in different parts of the world, especially winning the hearts of Muslim youth and those more politically engaged. Hence, until the 1980s, Islam has become more visible in the international arena, but also on the domestic level in Western European countries, which are now home to a fair number of Muslim immigrants. It is in these circumstances that multicultural policies and theories were being developed in order to find sustainable models for cohabitation and integration of Muslim immigrants into Western European societies. The biggest challenge was how to incorporate Islamic religion to the already existing secular framework which dominated social and political spheres of life. And so, European liberals tried to impose their values and worldviews to Muslim immigrants. In doing so, they represented liberal values as universal and transcultural, despite that not being quite true. Although that could be claimed for some European values, it certainly doesn't apply to others, such as individualism and almost unlimited freedom of speech. No doubt that the latter can't be considered as universal from the Islamic point of view. This is especially true when we have in mind occurrences such as Rushdie affair that emerged more than 3 decades ago, Danish Mohammed cartoons controversy from 2005-2006, Charlie Hebdo and Copenhagen shootings, both resulting in multiple deaths in 2015, as well as a recent murder of French middle school teacher Samuel Paty, just to name a few examples. Muslims simply find unlimited freedom of speech incompatible with Islam, no matter how hard liberals try to convince them and others that their reasoning is the only one correct. The situation is worsened by the fact that Islam also considers itself to be universal in its nature. So what actually is going on is a standoff of two competing universal worldviews. It should also be noted how Muslims first got in touch with these values propagated by the European liberals. It was through colonial and imperial ventures of the West. Therefore, it is no surprise this revives negative sentiments and leads to repulsion. One might ask, how come other ethnic and religious groups don't face similar problems in accommodating to life in the West? Well, they probably do, but they either eventually manage to find a balance between their given traditions and liberal values, or cave in due to eagerness to better fit in these new societies, or due to diffidence and imposed feeling of inferiority of their own cultures. But when it comes to Muslims, they usually have no doubt when it comes to Islamic stances. Their standpoint is firmly cemented by Islamic extreme sense of exceptionalism and superiority, a feature rarely present in other traditions, at least to this amount. The situation is emphasized by the fact that Islam itself claims universality, same as Western liberals do. So why would then Muslims give in when they already are obeying God's will? Maybe it is the other party that should do so. These feelings are confirmed by Quranic self-proclaiming as the final revelation and impeccable word of God. The Muslim collective pride is further strengthened by constantly present imagery of the glory days of Islam, its famous victories on the battlefield, and rapid spread of its in the first centuries of Islamic history, which is nowadays, when Muslims experience joint struggle and feel oppressed in many parts of the world, often reproduced as a rare source of Muslim self-esteem. In that sense, it is understandable why some Muslims in Europe refuse to rethink their position on some controversial matters. For example, although Quran pays respect to Judaism and Christianity, it regards them inferior to Islam. Same goes for adherents of the two religions. Since they follow earlier revelations of God, they can practice their religion freely, but it is preferable if they convert to Islam, which is described as a continuation and an improved version of the two earlier monotheistic religions. It is a prescribed duty of every Muslim to invite them to do so, and that doesn't go only for Christians and Jews, but especially for all the others who adhere to unworthy polytheistic beliefs or even deny the divine existence. So Muslims living in the Western Europe do support others learning about their religion, but on the other hand, they refuse to do the same, as apostasy from Islam is strongly forbidden and deserves severe punishment. Similar biased and one-sided stances to multicultural practices is noticeable when it comes to marriage between different religious groups. Muslim women are strictly forbidden to marry non-Muslims, while Muslim men are allowed to choose non-Muslim partners. When the latter occurs, any children born from such marriages are to be raised as Muslims, and even those women who married into Islam are encouraged and even expected to embrace Islam and convert. European Muslims are not the only ones to make multiculturalism one-sided. Native Europeans sometimes do it as well. This comes to attention particularly when it goes to accommodating some Islamic practices, including halal foods on menus of public institutions wasn't such a big of a challenge. But that can't be said when it comes to wearing a hijab, Muslim headscarf. When hijab moved religion from the private sphere of life to public realm, Western Europe and its multiculturalism based on secular and liberal foundations showed its limitations. This is probably one of the best examples that illustrates Islam as a challenge for multiculturalism. The French case is especially interesting in this regard. A debate about girls wearing headscarves to public schools arose in 1989, and eventually led to a law forbidding wearing any kind of conspicuous religious signs to public schools in 2004. During these 15 years and later on, it was claimed by the French state that wearing hijab is contrary to the constitutional principle of laïcité. Unlike Christians wearing cross or Jews wearing their kippah skull cap, hijab was found problematic and deemed ostentatious, provocative, and proselytizing, among other things. The former two were seen as discrete religious symbols and therefore acceptable, but Muslim headscarf, on the other hand, was described as discriminatory and oppressive to girls who are allegedly coerced to wear it. Claims of hijab being proselytizing and sort of pressure to other Muslim girls to follow the same practice are very arbitrary. The same could be argued about any other religious symbol, being it cross or something else. Most of these different religious symbols usually have a similar meaning, but the cross is just more acceptable than hijab, not because it is more discreet, rather since it is something Europeans are used to seeing. That is what makes it invisible to the public eye. Therefore, one may assert hijab will also become unnoticeable over time when the controversy about wearing it in schools and other public places fades out. Nevertheless, hijab matter saw obviously unequal treatment in public schools in France, and that was accompanied by a dangerous assumption that all girls who wear hijab are forced to do so. Actually, the whole hijab debate in France was put by the media into the framework of a fight for women's emancipation and gender equality in opposition to backward and oppressive Islam, and those Muslim women advocating against wearing hijab were put forward as real spokespersons of all Muslim women. Those defending the right of Muslim girls and women to make a free choice whether they wear hijab or not were often outvoiced in public by claims that traditional patriarchal system keeps Muslim women uninformed of available alternatives and predetermines their decisions on the matter. Although that might be true in some cases, some proportion of Muslim women for sure decides to wear hijab due to their own deep religious beliefs. Others may do so in order to protect themselves from the unwanted attention of men and temptations by conveying a subtle message about them not being interested in such interactions. Reasons may also be found in a desire to dispel parental and communal fear about Muslim girls and women engaging in a society which propagates different values from their own. The latter might especially be the case with Muslim schoolgirls whose participation in social life can represent a source of anxiety for their parents. In such contexts, if European institutions and policymakers pushed hardly on an idea that Muslim girls should refuse to wear hijab in order to liberate themselves from imposed constraints and challenge their subordinate position, that could discourage their families from supporting them to pursue education and forge social ties outside their own communities. In that sense, banning the hijab, such as France did in public schools, even though a very small number of Muslim girls did wear it actually, could make integration even harder. Such policies can inflict harm to multiculturalism and actually sustain arguments of assimilation as the only viable option for resolving the Muslim question in Europe. If secular and liberal values are so threatened by the hijab and hairscarf, what could then be expected when it comes to niqab and burqa, veils some Muslim women wear to cover their faces fully? No wonder then that many Western European countries forbade women from wearing full-face veils in public, either on a national or a local level, or at least bans were introduced for some locations and public institutions. Security reasons certainly play an important role in this And to be fair, it should be said that full-face veils are not a generally accepted practice among all adherents to Islam. On the contrary, even some Muslim majority countries such as Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan have introduced bans on wearing full-face veils in public. Still, regardless of that and what one might think of it, this is another practice European multiculturalism didn't manage to accommodate to. So with the Western liberals trying to impose their worldviews as universal on one side and with the Muslim sense of superiority on the other side, as British Indian political philosopher and theorist of multiculturalism Parekh notes, the stage is now set for mutual hostility and suspicion. Each fears the other not just politically but morally and culturally, and sincerely believes that it cannot survive without defeating the other. The fear is particularly acute among liberals and leads to a veritable panic. Unlike the religious Muslims who feel sure that God is on their side, liberals have no such certainty and must protect their values and way of life themselves. Having long thought that history was on their side, they now find that it is acting capriciously and signaling the return of dark ages that they had successfully seen off several centuries ago. Like most such panics, the liberal panic is partly fueled by a lingering self-doubt. Despite much agonizing reflection in recent years, the more self-critical liberals realize that they cannot make a transculturally compelling case for some of their cherished values. Compelling others to live by the latter, therefore, gives them an uneasy conscience. Since Muslims precipitate it, they become a moral irritant and object of fear and resentment. Unfortunately, at the same time as the debate rose on the compatibility of Islam with Western values and Muslim ability to live in multicultural societies, the general conditions and security situation in many parts of the Muslim world deteriorated. Instability in the Middle East and some other regions, especially Iran-Iraq war, civil war in Lebanon, the Gulf War, war in Afghanistan, and other conflicts led to heightened influx of newcomers from the region. In addition to that, since the last quarter of the 20th century, there is a worldwide movement of people from the east to the west and from the south to the north, in search for higher education, better economic opportunities, and political and religious freedom. This led to a public expression of xenophobia and a panic about the rate of immigration. For example, in 1993, the question was raised, can the Netherlands accommodate any more immigrants? And that was almost 30 years ago. A few isolated terrorist attacks, such as 1995 public transportation bombings in France, led to public awareness of the threat of Islamist terrorism. Of course, this further boosted the fears of Islam among Europeans. It climaxed after 9/11, followed by 2004 Madrid train bombings and 2005 London attacks. The first decade of the 21st century brought little good to the Muslim world. Western interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, often seen as unjust and neo-colonial, further enforced illiberal and radical movements. A spirit of hope that came with so-called Arab Spring soon ended in disappointment. What followed was thousands and thousands of immigrants heading to Europe. With the increased number of Muslim immigrants, the fear of Islam among native Europeans grew. Research has shown that even prior to 2015, when the immigrant inflow peaked, many Europeans had their concerns about Muslims and Islam. For example, 2013 Religious Monitor survey showed that 60% of Spanish and 45% of the British population felt fear of Islam. In that context, it is no surprise that a study by the European Parliament Research Service has shown that the share of Muslims who perceive discrimination on the grounds of religion or belief has increased from 12% in 2010 to 25% in 2016, When it comes to the job market, these figures are even higher, as a 2017 report showed that nearly a third of Muslims living in Western European countries reported they were discriminated when it comes to employment, and when it comes to women wearing headscarves, the number is as high as 40%. But Europeans aren't the only ones who have negative attitudes towards the other party. Many Muslims have negative feelings towards the West and Western culture. They see themselves as victims of Western hegemony and therefore hang tightly to Islamic culture, traditions, and norms as a means for saving them from total disintegration. In addition to intolerant and even inflammatory political and media discourse, many Muslim immigrants belong to precarious labor force. They work in black or gray economies, have short-term and part-time jobs, or so-called 3D jobs demanding dirty and dangerous, and therefore their prospects seem very unpredictable and uncertain. In these highly insecure and unsteady conditions, they struggle to achieve financial and psychological well-being. This is especially the case when it comes to a small number of Muslim youth. Generally speaking, in many European countries, Muslim students tend to do worse in school comparing to others. In addition to that, they often come from families struggling to make ends meet. These unfavorable circumstances led to their ghettoization, especially when they meet hardship in finding employment. Due to the limited possibilities, some of these young Muslims turn to crime and drugs. Others, in lack of other options, turn to Islam as a source of positive self-identification and pride. Interestingly, many Muslim youth who pursue higher education follow this path as well. It is important to note that those from second and third generations of immigrants in many cases feel they don't belong to their receiving countries. They see themselves as strangers living in a foreign land. To make things worse, they also feel distant from their parental cultures, as ties with countries of origin get weaker and weaker over time. It is often assumed that these people are torn between two competing cultures and identities, but rather they are alienated from both their parents' homelands and countries they settled in. This deculturalization that they experience has a major impact on their perception of Islam. It is much distinct from the version of Islam their parents had, since it is stripped of its socio-cultural context, which shaped its practices through particular historical experiences of different regions and ethnic groups. In this way, Islam is brought down only to its textual component and mere ethic and legal norms, which is in complete opposition to the historical tradition of Islam, since Islamic dogma always adapted to accommodate to the specific local context in every given region and period of history. Islam, to which these younger European Muslims adhere to, is hence based solely on the interpretation of Quranic scripture and advocates creating of a uniform Muslim identity in order to be suitable for believers from a large variety of ethnic groups that originate from all over the world. This is accompanied by Islamist dogmatic reductionism and simplification, which makes these teachings more acceptable, especially to those with less religious education. When represented as a radical alternative to everything that's wrong and unjust, not only in their communities but in the world in general, radical Islamism becomes even more appealing. This is the most evident in places where the intercivilizational frictions are more intense, such as Western Europe. For that reason, research showed that Islamic State had higher support among Arabic-speaking social media users in countries such as Belgium, UK, and France than was the case in Syria, Iraq, and even Saudi Arabia. So it is members of this specific underclass or alienated young European Muslims that makes the news and headlines. They are the ones perpetrating those infamous terrorist attacks. They refuse to be European Muslims and choose only to live in Europe exclusively in accordance with Islamic values. But this describes just a small number of Muslims living in European countries. It is the upper-mentioned unstable social-psychological atmosphere that makes them easy to manipulate. Due to that, some of them see a way out of this unfavorable situation in embracing radical Islamist teachings that include exclusivist and elitist ideas that give self-confidence and a sense of superiority to those who before considered themselves inferior on many levels. No doubt that when looking for the main incentive that turns people toward radical Islamism, we should focus on the social-political context in which this trend occurs. Islam becomes reality only with its social expression, through human mediation, and thus the roots of radical Islamism lie deeply rooted in the political grounds. The current situation in Europe, unfortunately, seems to be fertile ground for such occurrences. It should be stressed that not only Muslims follow this kind of interpretations, quite opposite. Many of them actually are and do their best to be good, loyal citizens of the Western European countries. Nevertheless, it is often portrayed differently, especially by those who tend to exploit the situation, such as nowadays more and more vocal populists. They tend to gain the support of the masses by channeling public's general dissatisfaction with social, economic and political conditions or frustrations with personal status toward groups and individuals who not only don't bear responsibility for the situation in question, but are actually facing the same unfavorable conditions as the majority of the European population. A large influx of migrants and refugees from the Muslim-majority countries in the Middle East, North Africa and West Asia in recent years made Muslim immigrants, both newcomers and those who have already settled in Europe before, some of them even 2 or 3 generations ago, an ideal outgroup for the populist rhetoric, so they are often accused of being bloodthirsty terrorists, a threat to the national identity, a burden for the state budget because they drain money from public funds, and so on. If populist parties who had a fair share of success on national and European elections in recent years keep their current anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant inflammatory rhetoric and boosting discrimination, the existing social cleavages can only get deeper and push more Muslims in Europe towards radicalism and ghettoization. To prevent that from happening, it should be commonly acknowledged that both Muslim immigrants and native European population act negatively towards one another in a self-perpetuating vicious circle. Muslim refusal to integrate into the European society is fed by European imposing of liberal values, anti-Muslim attitudes and many cases of discriminations and vice versa. So both parties must address their responsibilities for the failure of integration and multiculturalism. Only with doing so can we cope for current negative trends to stop. What is the way to achieve that goal? Is it multiculturalism reimagined in the framework of muscular liberalism to do it? Or maybe we should put more hopes in Euro-Islam or blend of the two. Muscular liberalism, as proposed first by British Prime Minister David Cameron, is an alternative to old-fashioned failed multiculturalism that in his own words encouraged different cultures to live separate lives, apart from each other and apart from the mainstream, and didn't manage to provide a vision of society to which they feel they want to belong. To correct that, assertive policies should be conducted while strengthening national identity, clearly promoting all liberal values which are crucial for the society and also harshly confronting retrogressive elements. Not only that kind of liberalism is actually illiberal and repressive, but also not much supportive evidence can be found for its success, even though a decade has passed since this approach has been suggested. On the other hand, we have Euro-Islam, proposed by some other authors. It doesn't matter much whether it is the version that upholds Muslims in Europe should embrace liberal European values and accept the separation of secular and religious spheres of life, as Bassam Tibi suggests, or that of Tariq Ramadan, who advocates preserving Islamic ethics while participating in the social and cultural life of secular Europe. Either way, Euro-Islam is basically a framework designated to help European Muslims reinterpret their religion in the European context in order to overcome the obstacles of life in Western Europe they face. Although these ideas do sound compelling, the question rises how to convince European Muslims to follow them and turn these new theological approaches to Islam made in particular Western European minority context into reality and generally accepted practice. So far, it did have some success, but there are still lots of hearts and minds to win over. Therefore, we can conclude that the challenge of finding common grounds and reconciling multiculturalism and Islam is yet to be answered. Until theorists manage to do so, it is important to make efforts to confine populism and work hard on improving socio-economic conditions of European Muslims in order to prevent their youth from turning to undesirable practices and actions that can damage current, already somewhat difficult positions. Thank you very much for your attention.